welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, where we talk about how writing works, how writers work, and why the best writers risk being strange. And I'm here with Matthew Medney, who we've talked to before. If you want to go check the old episodes, search Medney, Medney, to pull up our other chat with Matt, where we kind of ran through scattershot a lot of his cool projects. But now he's got some new cool projects and also a new publishing company, Gungnir Press or Gungnir Books, I suppose. But sort of, Matt, before we get to Gungnir, I'd like to just sort of start. One thing we didn't really talk too much about last time was sort of your journey as a writer and then as a publisher. And I'm really interested in this because I myself am a writer who then, started a publishing company. So I've got, much smaller, less impressive publishing company called Stranger Fiction. But nevertheless, I'm sort of in that situation of kind of moving from writing to editing to publishing. I'm still, of course, primarily a writer, but, that's also been my journey. I'm really curious to know, you've been doing it all at a much kind of more impressive level than I have. And I'm curious to know sort of how it all started with you. Just sort of I'm kind of just curious about the standard, early days of what kind of got you into being a writer in the first place. Because I know you had sort of a kind of a career going on in the music business. And then kind of what led you to hero projects and the sort of early days of packaging and publishing. If you could kind of just maybe kind of give the Matt Medney origin story.
Totally. Not like Stan Lee, where he just blanketed everyone as an X-Men because he got lazy on origin stories. But my father was a copywriter and sort of a slug line writer for an ad agency for most of his career. He also designed some toys and some other things, but at the end of the day, he was really like a wordsmith with quippy one-liners, and I always thought words could be really great weapons if used in the right way. And I was never as attracted to the quick one-liners. I was always attracted to long form writing. Um, I always like to say that it is confusing to me what guidance counselors get paid for because I got a perfect score on the writing section of my SATs, and not one of them told me to go into journalism. So I thought it's quite fantastic. But as you had said, I'd spent about a decade in the music business doing pyrotechnics and stage design and management of bands on the road. And throughout that process, I had realized that it was, a 5 to 1 on your life because most people might think that that sounds like a party, that you're spending 10 years on the road partying. And for the artists, it definitely is. For the techies doing all of the stage design and the storytelling of the stage, it is 18-hour days. So I knew that I needed to figure out a way to take the relationships I'd built in music and find something that was a little bit more conducive to having a life in addition to a career. And I said, let's write comic books for these musicians because it was something that I'd always thought was interesting. And I thought that music videos at the time were a bit dated. The idea of them, you would have some creative director that has some esoteric idea that wouldn't necessarily connect to a story. And I'm speaking specifically in the dance music space. That pop music, it was a whole different beast. But in the dance music space, that was very much how the music videos would go. And I was like, let's make a comic book where the main character is the artist and they go on a journey, and then we animate that comic book as their music video, and they sell the comic book on the road during their shows. Bada bing, bada boom. And we'd done one for Shaggy and his dance pop song with Nicky Jam called Body Good. And that got some notoriety. And we sort of took off from there. Ended up doing comic books for music festivals as a whole too, not just for the artists. And branded a festival called Project Z, and then did Rolling Loud Music Festival. Then we went into sports and did Floyd Mayweather and Bobby Wagner and Cam Jordan, both NFL defensive ends and middle linebackers. And that journey of writing was just something that I'd always found to be like my happy place. And while I was on the road, you know, dialing back a little bit, I had started writing what would become Beyond Kuiper with John Connolly. And we spent, it was funny because when we started outlining that book, neither of us had ever written a prose book before. It's probably 2016, maybe 2017 at the time. And we had a really clear vision of the world and the story. And we'd written maybe 500 pages of lore around it. Everything from our main characters' great grandfathers and their decisions, and those decisions, how they impacted a decision that was consequential to our story. And it was really a intricate web, but neither of us had ever written a prose before, didn't know if we could. All of those things that a first time author probably has real imposter syndrome around. So we started interviewing ghostwriters to write it. And we had commissioned maybe a dozen ghostwriters to do like a passage. And every time we just didn't think it hit the tone. It wasn't what we were really going for. Beyond Kuiper, in addition to being a great science fiction saga, is really like a love letter to the science community. Like our hope is like, sure, the everyday reader should like it, but the aerospace engineer at Lockheed Martin and Boeing should love it. And that was always the intent. And that's a very hard tone to nail, and I think we're still working on it, even with the second book. The second book now is coming out about 5 years after the first one. It's really technical. We're hoping the third one will come out much faster than that. We're pretty confident it will, but we just couldn't find a writer that we really loved. And then one day I was rewatching Contact, the Carl Sagan film, and then I ended up rereading Pale Blue Dot, and it sort of just connected in my head that the intro to the book, which takes place in around 2092, is our main character Bernard reading a version of Pale Blue Dot that he had gotten from Carl Sagan, what his great grandfather had gotten from Carl Sagan 100 years earlier. And he takes that letter and puts in his drawer, and it sort of launches us off into this determination of him getting to space. And like I saw it, and we were like, "Screw it, let's go for it, let's write it." And then we did. So that's sort of like the origins of the first book that we put out. And now, I think this
Sorry,
podcast is gonna. Oh,
can I
sorry.
pause you for a second? Because
Yes.
so you kind of packed a bunch of stuff in there, and there's some really interesting kind of moments I wouldn't mind just lingering on. So when you start, I'm interested in this idea that you would, you were, even though you'd written these comics and you'd done a bunch of writing, you're, more or less, maybe you're not thinking of yourself as a professional writer, but you're sort of operating like a professional writer on a certain level. And it's curious to me that you would not necessarily think of yourself as the prose writer.
Yeah.
What was the sort of block in your mind around like, oh, I need a ghostwriter to do this for me rather than doing it, yourself? Did you just
Yeah.
think you didn't have the skill, or you just think you didn't have the time, or did you just feel like it wasn't what was the sort of block for you where you didn't think of yourself first as a prose writer? I'm just
I didn't
curious.
think, yeah, I didn't think I was a writer yet. Right. It was still
Really?
early days. I mean, at that point when we were outlining that, I might have published 5 comics at that point. Maybe.
Sure.
Today I think I've published something like 50 different stories. And we have five prose books out. So it's a very different mentality.
So how long did that
To
book take to write then, the Beyond Cooper?
uh, like the first draft before it went to editing,
Before it comes out, more or less.
4 years.
Okay,
four
sure.
years and
So you're
I had and something that I have no shame in telling people, but I did do was in the middle of writing it, I had stopped tour managing, which was my main source of income, to focus on writing the book, and I
right.
ended up spending 8 months driving Uber to cover bills while I focused all of my energy on writing the book.
Yeah, sure. Right. No, that's interesting. So yeah, so I see kind of how that all click together. So at this point, when you're kind of deciding, no, I'll do the writing, I'll try it out, I'll commit to it. What was the thing that kept you at it then? Because it is a big commitment in a relatively short span of time to go from, I don't feel like I'm the person who can write this book, but maybe I could come up with the idea to I'm going to quit my job and drive Uber as if I need to, and just all my time now full time is working on this book, even though no one's paying me to do it.
Yeah, that's kind of just
It's a
when you
real
say it when you say it
shift.
like that, it sounds like a crazy decision.
I mean, I don't think
uh
it's crazy, but I always saw myself as the writer.
yeah. Yeah, I don't know. When you work with musicians, as the production guy for an extended period of time, it takes a lot of deprogramming to get yourself into the mentality that you are the creative as well. And I think that was part of it there. And it made me realize, very quickly after I took a stab at that first passage with the pale blue dot allegory, that I could write it. And I think when that light bulb turned on and that switch happened, it was very clear that I understood how to structure that.
And you sort of just clicked in your head like, oh, maybe I'm a creative person, because you'd be kind of, even though you were in a position where you'd kind of been doing creative work, you maybe weren't seeing it that way yourself.
Exactly. I think
A-
that's right.
And then with hero projects, which you're still doing, but in the kind of early days of that, where you start like putting these comics together for these bands and all that stuff, um, even though you're doing the writing, you're not necessarily thinking of yourself as a writer. You're just sort of, I'm
Mm,
the one who's writing, I guess. Is that sort of where you're
I think
coming at it
so.
from?
Yeah, I think that there's a little bit of that. Like I was putting together these stories for the bands, right? But it wasn't necessarily I was a writer, and for anyone that's written comics, it's much more like writing a script than it is writing
Yeah.
prose, right? And that's what I ended up falling in love with writing the prose, is that you can put on some classical music and just like sit in front of my computer and write ideas.
I also come out of music originally. I don't do it anymore, but I was a singer in a band and, and so on and so forth. And I also did a bunch of stuff in kind of like music and film, both industries where, as you say, you kind of have that problem of you can have life or you can do this career. Um, and when I always coming out of music though into kind of taking my writing more seriously, uh, one of the things I really appreciated as a writer, a prose writer primarily at that point, was I didn't need other people to agree with me anymore. Like you're maybe co-writing a thing, so it's a little different. But I like the idea that I could have control over this thing. It didn't need to like, because in the band it was always difficult being the singer in the band, who is you're the face of the band, but you're also in a certain sense the least important person in the band, not to the public, but in terms of getting anything done. Because I can't play guitar, I can't play the drums. Well, I can't do anything now unless these guys get it together. And we
Yes.
would always, I was in a weird position where we were a very popular band among a certain demographic in the city, but then every summer we would get invited to festivals, but the guys in the band would just screw off in the summer. So all the money we could make was, so like we'd have all these paying gigs offered to us. We'd turn them all down. And then the other 8 months of the year, we would take all these non-paying gigs because those were the only ones that they wanted to do. It was very
Classic.
aggravating. And we just couldn't build a following. We kept like kind of like we could sell out an underage club, but we couldn't play, we could just play to the amount of people that would break us even at an overage club. And we could never get above that because, these guys just wouldn't play in the band. Like they wanted to go, have fun with girls in the summer, which I understand, but like I was like, well, I want to do this thing, the whole year. Like this is what I'm trying to do, you know. But
Mm-hmm.
in
I
writing is
know
like,
that. I feel that pain.
you know,
I
but
know that pain so well.
in writing it was like, oh well, I don't need somebody else to tell them. I can do it whenever I want. I can do whatever I want. Maybe I'm not making any money at it, but I can focus on it, and
Yes.
I don't need another person. Comics is a little different because it is more collaborative, and then of course these co-writing projects, again, you can get more collaborative. But what I always appreciate about the prose is like, if I can do prose, I can always do something
Mm-hmm.
that I'm in total control of.
Yes.
And then, so how does this all kind of develop into you becoming the CEO of heavy metal?
Yeah. So I guess it would have been the fall of 2019. Um, Heroes doing pretty good. We had just finished a four-festival run with the Rolling Loud Music Festival, the premier hip hop festival in the world. And we had done a huge activation there where we created a comic book per stop. So we had one that was custom for the San Francisco show, the Miami show, the New York and the LA shows. And then we also built an installation uh where it was like a big tent where you could have Rolling Loud cereal and read comic books. So if you want to like jump out of the music, you go have a bowl of Rolling Loud O's while reading a comic. And we traveled this across the four festivals. Pretty epic. Um and I and it was just like it was amazing. It was really really cool live activation, comics, storytelling, the works. And a friend of a friend knew the um I guess you would call it the board, the financial holdings company of heavy metal, and they were looking for a new regime. The people that own the IP were looking for a different take on how to keep it going, bring it into a new time, et cetera, et cetera. I met with them a handful of times. Uh, there was alignment on what that could be. And then we did a deal where I took over in January of 2020, which was a very fascinating time to take over any company. Um, and
Yes. I also started a company in January 2020,
I
which
live, yeah, it was quite fascinating time to do that. And we navigated it well. There was definitely some I feel wrong using the phrase benefits, but there were some positives to the time where, you know, film, game, TV show productions were non-existent. So printed media had a moment where, we did have a window where our e-commerce store exploded. And that was really exciting and a lot of fun to work with. Um, and then, 3 years doing that, um, running that brand was amazing. And sometimes I had a very specific vision of what I wanted to do within publishing and within storytelling and hopefully within adaptations. And some of those ideas were potentially not to the core what heavy metal was, and we had decided to part ways. And then I started Gungnir about 5 months after I left in about almost exactly to the day 3 years after I started in January of 23. I always like to say it is if on a scale of 0 to 100, 0 being the most appropriate and 100 being inappropriate, a Disney princess is a 6, Avengers Endgame is a 70, and traditional heavy metal is a 195. And I had always seen a sweet spot at about 110.
Right.
Still past quote unquote acceptability, but um close enough that it could still become mainstream and be punk rock and be heavy metal. Um, and that motion downward, uh, I think takes a lot of not just financial commitment, but a lot of understanding that you're going to lose some fans along the way that like that 130 to 170 range on that allegory.
Right.
And I think I was in the minority of people who thought it was worth that risk of that fandom. That's life. But that is, I think, where Gungnir sits is probably a little bit lower. I like to say that we're a four quadrant studio publisher, not like our entire studio will have something for everyone, but that doesn't mean that everything will be for everyone. And I think that's a really important distinction that a lot of studios and publishers don't think about. You don't need to make every story comfortable for every audience, but you should, as an entity, have stories that are comfortable for all audiences so that families can enjoy your brand as a whole.
Our joke around the studio when heavy metal and you come up is whatever people say about Medney and heavy metal, what they're really mad about is that he put clothes on Tarna.
I
Um,
almost got canceled for putting clothes on Tarna.
it's
Oh,
like a
that's
reverse
a true story.
cancellation.
We we
It's
we
so
joked
funny.
about it when that happened. It was episode 6 of the Tarna new storyline. We put body armor on her for half the story, mind you. The
Yeah,
story
she's
ended
naked in
with
the
her
start of the story, like Tarna
only
always
naked at
is,
the
coming
end.
out of the water. In the new heavy metal, it's the same thing. Yeah, yeah, and I didn't, but it it's the weird
It's a good time.
reverse cancellation scenario. It made me laugh, not like from afar, just because I felt bad for kind of the reaction. I thought it was ridiculous, but I also was like, it's so absurd that like it just makes no sense at all, like this reaction. But anyways, so after you kind of leave heavy metal and you start Gungnir Press, what is the sort of the would you mind getting just a little bit further into the motivation for starting Gungnir Press? Because another person having kind of the experience of taking on a big publishing, being the CEO of a major indie publisher,
Hmm.
um, another person coming out of that, and it's not just like you left because there was a backlash over Tarna. Like one of your main motivations was like I need to get back to being a writer, right? And so as much as this is a lot of the business stuff, like you know, and business stuff is great and everything, and you obviously have a facility and an interest in business, but obviously, again, seeing yourself by this point as a creative first, I suspect there's, and just from talking to you, I feel like the sense of it in that period also was this is all great, but I was a creative before all this. And now
Exactly.
I'm sort of like I'm still doing creative things, but I'm kind of back in the shadow world of shadow work. Um,
And that was a big uphill battle. I really wanted to be my own writer. And, you know, when you're running a company like heavy metal, um, when you're running a company that you did not start, that has legacy, you effectively become chief HR officer, not chief executive officer. And a lot of people don't necessarily understand that. Um, when it's your own company that you've started from the ground up, you wear every hat the whole time. When you take a company that has the legacy and the admiration that heavy metal does, your main goal is to make sure the ship doesn't sink. And you then become HR for the entire team. And that was something that was difficult for me to navigate as someone who wanted to be a creative first.
And coming out of that, and here's your opportunity to kind of be back to being a creative first. But then, you're starting another publishing company. Now it is different, as you say, and I think you're right. People don't understand the difference. But if you're the owner, or at least the core owner of a company, it is a very different world than I've got a board, I've got, majority investors. Like it's different. It's a different world.
Yeah.
To And it's good and bad. That is a different world. But what was sort of your motivation to kind of really try this publishing thing again in a more under my control kind of way, but still at a good size scale? Like Gungnir is not it's a new publisher, it's an indie publisher, but it isn't a small publisher exactly. Like you're doing hardcover premium books. You've got, some major distribution deals in place and so on. Yeah, you got this book, Last Breeds, that me and Matt and Gregory and Lyndon and Zach and Scott
Is there
Henderson
a
have been
video
working on.
aspect to this podcast? Or does it
I
happen in
like to
audio?
put the video up. Yes, I
You
like it
do?
on
Okay, so
YouTube.
me
Yeah.
making facial reactions like this will live somewhere. It
So
won't just
yeah, the
be burned
audio
into your
it'll
head.
be on YouTube. Yes. But yeah, this if people are getting a little sneak peek of Last Breeds, which by the time you hear this podcast will have been announced in a
Yeah.
more detailed way. But right now, it's still, well, as I'm talking to Matt, it's still a bit of a secret
Nobody knows. The
project.
world does not know that it exists. But what we do know is, and Jonathan has to take all the credit here. Is he's built this amazing friendship with Scott Snyder, who I think is one of the most interesting writers out there right now. Not just because he was the top-selling comic book writer last year, but because he did something that I don't think had been done since Grant Morrison, which is take Batman and do a new
Yeah,
twist on it, right?
it's an impressive Batman story that he did, and
Really impressive Batman story, and he's a big fan of Last Breeds, which is pretty cool to see and witness.
he's been a very a supportive guy. But yes, and so one of the nice things that Scott has done for me over the last little while is give us a great quote on Last Breeds. So if you look at the back of that book, people will see a great Scott Snyder quote. But I mean, you can talk about Last Breeds and everything connected to this, but like, again, what's sort of your headspace and when you're like, I'm gonna do this Gungnir press. I have the publishing bug now. Um,
Yeah,
but I want to do it a different way or a certain way. What is sort of what were you? Why not just be a creative? I guess.
yeah. It's a great question. I sometimes ask myself that consistently. But I think it's um a couple of reasons. Um, One is I don't think I like the idea that I could come up with an idea that I liked, that I thought was interesting to explore. And before I had the space to explore it and fine tune it and really bring it to life, which I think happens in the creation process, not in the pitch process, you have to decide on if it's going to be made because you have to sell it to somebody else in a pitch process. But I think because we did it firsthand, Last Breeds evolved from what it was in the pitch to what it became because we gave it the space to explore the ideas. And that is what I find the most interesting is being able to explore those ideas and do those things. You can't really do that when you're pitching an idea the whole time and not being able to actually do those things. So at first I did think about it, and I pitched a couple things around town and got some really good feedback. And, all of the things that I got as feedback in my head, I was like, yeah, that just sounds like something that we would hammer out while we're creating it. Why do I need to know that right now? I think the top line ideas are what matters. And I just felt like I had a very different perspective on it. And then I realized that I had skills and knowledge that were maybe atypical for a writer. The ability to package, the ability to understand how to print and how to put together systems for publishing. And it all sort of led to the idea that I should just have a publisher. And then I talked to Steve Orlando, who's one of our partners on this, and uh, he had a similar sentiment where he wanted to be able to explore stories outside of capes. He loves capes, obviously, and he's one, in my opinion, one of the best capes writers working today. But exploring stories that aren't capes, that the big two used to do with Vertigo and History of Violence and Road to Perdition, and really interesting stories. And that was sort of what we wanted to do with Gungnir, is take stories that are not capes and take interesting ideas and sort of go back to basics of storytelling, where our books pose a question to the reader. And that is at the core what all books should do. But I think that we can all agree that maybe at some point, that changed, right? That changed where that was not necessarily the impetus of how books were being made and how stories were being conveyed. And that's something that we wanted to change. And I think that all led to the idea of wanting to publish. And then um, I realized that we should do cool hardcover books. And that was a whole other journey.
And why is that so important to you to do a hardcover as opposed to, say, keeping the costs lower with the soft cover and so on and so forth, particularly for a new publisher
Yeah,
who maybe doesn't, have a backlist to support the press at this point?
totally. And it definitely is more difficult to do it the way that I've gone out to do it. It would be a lot simpler to do it how you just said, but I'm a firm believer that you only get one chance to show who you are. And I'm really um, convinced that a reason publishing has taken a back seat in the last few decades is because the presentation of the physical product became a delivery mechanism and not an art form. And we wanted to show that the way you get the story is also an art form, not just what you're reading and what you're consuming. So it was really important to us to have that sort of alchemy for what somebody receives.
My complaint about publishing is always they are trying to sell books to people who don't read. That's their actual business model. You're selling a book to a person who's going to buy it at Christmas time to give to their sister, or like that's the business model, and it to me it makes no sense. I always was baffled why they don't try to sell books to me. I'm a guy who spends $5,000 a year on books. I buy hundreds of books. And I don't want to buy a bunch of trash looking books. I'll spend $100 on a book if it's a nice, great book in a nice edition by a person who I admire or respect or something. I'll certainly easily spend $30 on a hardcover book. I don't want a paperback book that looks like trash. A nice paperback is different, or with some interior illustrations or like a nice design.
100%.
I mean, I buy lots of paperbacks. I publish paperbacks, but again, we tried when I do a publication, we're always like quoting out, well, can we put French flaps on it? Can we get some illustrations in there? Can we do full color on the inside? Can what's the what are the options, as opposed to just like the cheapest path possible, which I feel is too much of what publishing has become. Because ultimately, like, the cheapest path possible, those people don't, the people who want that book don't actually want that book. Like, they're happy to, they're like my mom who will just read it on an e-reader, or
Yes,
they're like somebody who's just buying it and discarding it, or somebody who's again buying it for a gift. To me, that's all fine readers that need to be serviced in some way, but they don't constitute to me a core customer that you can build an industry on.
I agree completely. And I think there's a truth to the idea that people, if you look at the book as a utility, the e-reader will always win. If you look at a book as a piece of art that sits on a shelf after you're done consuming it, now it could become a product that you'd invest in.
Yes, and the other thing I always will say about the publishing industry when I'm, berating it, um, in public or private, is the structure of the publishing industry, especially large publishing. Uh, and it's not every publisher and it's not every book, but I think the trend is they treat books as lost leaders, but they don't have another product that they're trying to sell you.
Exactly.
So it's just, you have this bizarre like industry of lost leaders, and the idea being mad, the sort of quote unquote product that they're really trying to sell, uh, in their minds, is often secondary rights. So they're trying to get a film made, but the buyer of the book is not the person who's going to make the film.
Correct.
So it doesn't even make sense on that level, um, to use the book as a loss leader to try to garner interest to a film adaptation. I'm walking into a bookstore buying a book off the shelf. I'm not going to buy the film rights to it. I actually,
Exactly.
it's so just what's the logic of that? To me, there isn't a logic. And so then they're taking return, then they add on all these things like they're going to take returns, they're going to do this, they're going to do that. Again, all of it can make sense if it's done a certain way or if you have certain margins, but you know, it's so much of it is just throwing things down a well and wishing. And to me, that's just not a sustainable model because it doesn't
I
scale.
could not agree more.
And so it's fine, to do that, I guess, if you have all the money in the world and you have the spaghetti, um, against the wall approach. It can work and it can sustain certain people with deep pockets, but in these in a certain in publishing, I feel like we've got this cultural movement where reading itself and publishing itself is becoming a niche activity for a niche audience. And there's an opportunity there, I think. The good news of it, I think, is there's an opportunity for a press like Gungnir, or, hopefully my press, where, you know, taking a different approach and really kind of focusing on a more niche customer like myself, who's, maybe there's not 8 billion of us, but there's, we spend money on books, and we'll spend a good amount of money on books, and we'll actually read the books, and we'll talk about the books, and so on.
Uh, ag- Agree completely. I think there's a a resurgence of timing that is going on right now with books where people want to use their imagination more. TV, film, gaming is amazing. The technology that we've invented to make visual spectacles is second to none, and I think that we're so numb to it. It's like the Eiffel Tower. It's like the Statue of Liberty. We don't grasp how amazing these structures are, and like Marvel movies are insane that they can come together the way they come together. Like nobody's giving that nearly enough credit. But I think on the same token, nobody is remembering how much value there is in letting someone's imagination run rampant from just words on a blank page.
How do you make a decision as a publisher, um, what books you want to do? Kind of on that
You,
note.
yeah, usually it's a decision between Steve, Jim, and I. Pitches come in from all places. We'll read it, we'll see it. Sometimes, like there was a pitch the other day that we read that we loved the meat of the story. We hated one of the words that was used to describe the monsters in the story, and we hated the title. So we sat down with the author and we're like, "Hey, we love a lot of this. Are you open to these sort of adjustments? And if you are, let's talk about a deal. And if you're not, totally get it. It's your IP." So things like that happen all the time. I would say it's really, you know, the guiding light for us is it needs to be weird. It needs to be genre, science fiction or fantasy, ideally. It needs to have an underlying, really meaningful message to it. And that message, political, apolitical, a question of the youth, a reflection of an older generation, et cetera, et cetera. And the author needs to care about the story, right? A lot of times people just pump things out because they want to, but they don't really have a perspective on it. Um, so that's really important to us too. And all of those things sort of create the factors as to whether or not we go no go on the story.
I forget who it was, but I remember I was reading somebody recently where they were talking about AI, uh, but their point was the AI doesn't have a point of view. And what, I think it was Rick Rubin actually. Yeah, he was saying the AI doesn't have a point of view, and what somebody's coming to an artist for is for a point of view. So he doesn't, he has ultimate points regarding around how he doesn't see AI as a threat and necessarily, but a potentially useful tool. But ultimately, whatever it is that you're doing, whether you're a human or a robot, you need that point of view, that perspective, as you say. It's often more important than being good at a strange level. Um, which sometimes I don't think people really understand. That perspective on the material, not just is it exciting, is it cool, but like, do you have a point of view on the story that you're
Yes,
telling?
exactly. Completely agree.
And then with Gungnir, can you talk a bit about the name and sort of your sort of ethos kind of connected to that and how that all plays
Yeah.
into everything?
Yeah. So Gungnir is like the spear of Odin. A lot of people think of Odin sort of as the Marvel caricature that they get from the Thor movies, and I think in maybe even one of the Avengers or two. But in Norse mythology, it tells a bit of a deeper story. He's also the god of poetry, of knowledge, of the spoken word. His spear, Gungnir itself, never missed its mark in action or in meaning. So our alliteration, our meaning, our allegory there is that we're wielding the power of poetry to tell epic storytelling in science fiction and fantasy.
What attracts you to those particular genres, science fiction and fantasy, over, say, other, you know, quote unquote literary non-genre? They call it in publishing mainstream fiction, although of course no one in reality thinks of that as mainstream. They think of genre as mainstream. But to use the publishing term, mainstream
Yeah,
fiction that is not a genre like science fiction, fantasy, horror, and mystery, and so on. What kind of attracts you to those particular genres?
I think it takes a more creative writer to write in those worlds. I think that those worlds are more interesting to me. I think that fantasy and definitely science fiction writers are the philosophers of today. There's no difference between what a science fiction author who is writing for the sake of a point of view is the same thing as a philosopher, is thinking about what could be and what was and what might be. with a really interesting veneer, and that really attracts me.
And what do you think is what are you most excited about with Gungnir these days? Or, you've got some big
Oof.
news as of this recording coming out, you will have recently really announced um your distribution setup and some other cool things. So do you want to maybe talk a bit about that
Yeah.
news and sort of what's sort of new and coming for Gungnir here?
Yeah, so we'll have the news of Macmillan publishing deal, which we're really excited about. It was a distribution deal. We have three imprints outside of just Gungnir. We have Asgard Books, which is with the animation studio Animation Avenue, owned by Spree. I'm really terrible. So sorry, Omar. I can't pronounce his last name. And that publisher is focused on video game adaptations into graphic novels. And we have some really exciting titles that are coming there. I'll tell you about it when we're off air. And then we have Storyteller Media, which we've already put out a book with Darian Sanders, the actor who plays Simba in The Lion King, which we're really excited about. And then we're bringing on Rogue Matter, which is this awesome publisher owned by branded content guys, Roger Mincheff and Trent Olson. And they are doing some amazing, amazing books. And Trent comes from working with Sandy Carpenter. Over at Storm Comics and is an amazing talent in the genre space. So I'm really excited about those books too. And then we have the Gungnir lines. I have my next prose series coming out, Existence Equation, which I'm really excited about. And then we have Last Breeds, which is going to be as uncensored nerds like to say today, as of this recording, Asshole Tarzan.
Asshole Tarzan. And I love yes, and Last Breeze, of course, you'll those listening will hear a lot more about it
Yeah.
now that I can talk a bit more about it because that's the book that me, Matthew, and Gregory co-created, and then and co-wrote and so on. And we had, worked with Scott Henderson as the artist, Zach Schuster as a colorist, and Lynn Redchenka as the letter, and Greg were also doing some art, and me doing sort of a chunk of the writing in a connection to with you know Matt and Gregory. So people will be hearing a lot about Last Breeds. We don't need to talk too much about it right now, but we certainly could. But I'm really excited about sort of the things that your press is doing there. Um, if only because it's doing, great looking books, that are really nice premium editions. It's my first hardcover comic, which I'm really excited about. And I'm, really happy with how that book turned out. As you
It
say,
looks amazing.
and I think, you know, you kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but just to kind of go back to it, I think the thing that really made that book better, and I think the thing that kind of keeps me in publishing uh, as a publisher as well as a writer, because I'll do, books or projects that I have, a publishing partner with, or I find, a publisher to take on.
Hmm.
I'll do things that I publish myself, and I'll do, things also in like film and so on. Like I'll try to sell things to people, but I'll also produce things, co-produce things myself and so on. Um, and to me, like the reason to do some of that stuff myself, and to take on, uh, and to not just, try to be getting like writing work from the big two and so on.
Hmm.
Like I would love some writing work from the big two, don't get me wrong, and I'm pursuing things like that. But where I'm not simply trying to do only that kind of thing and only books that publishers take on, why I have like why I try to build these partnerships and why I try to have my own sort of publishing projects is because I just think, as you were sort of saying earlier, certain projects have to have a different process. And if you're kind of teaming up with a publisher or getting hired by a publisher or a comics company or whatever, a film company, you have to fit into their workflow, you have to fit into their process, you have to fit into their system. And that's fine and that's great. And I am happy to do that, but not for certain things. Certain things have to have
Exactly.
a different process. With our book, The Eye Collector, which is a book you signed to Heavy Metal, and that, we're going to be doing some more stories with someone else. But with The Eye Collector, me and Gregory had developed a really precise and strange process that served that book. We actually had the first thing we did, Matt, was after I wrote a script for issue 1, we had Lyndon letter blank pages. So put final lettering on blank panels,
Hmm.
just to get the pacing, because it's horror and the pacing to me matters more than anything in horror. And Menon, thought we were crazy initially. Maybe he still thinks we're crazy, but he's like, "Why are you paying me to letter blank pages, and then paying me again to re-letter it all?" He's like, "It doesn't make any sense." I'm like, "This is the process," and we didn't do that the whole time, but it was something we did for like the first 3 or 4 issues, um, and it worked. And that thing had a certain process. For Last Piece, again, like you alluded to, we let it breathe, we let it develop over time, we let things shift. There were certain chapters where we spent a bit, we put some extra pages in those chapters. We didn't beholden ourselves to having everything exactly the way it would have to be if it was coming out on a newsstand every month or something. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but certain things you need a different system, because that's
Yes,
the process that's going to make the work.
exactly.
And it's, to me, all about the process and I always say, you need to make the book more of what it is and less of what it is not. And sometimes that
A
is,
100%.
yeah, and sometimes that works fine with someone else's process. And other times you need to have a weird process and you need to kind of protect the process at all costs. And, that might require you to have control over things like the paper. It might not, it might, right? And so I like having the options. I think, um, one thing I appreciated about uh, working with you on the Last Piece project, um, and this is something me and Gregory would often talk about, is that we're so used to, in our little world of our studio that we share, we're so used to, like doing it in a weird way. But then every once in a while, we'll have like culture shock where we'll come out and we'll start talking to somebody, or at a publisher or a production company or just some new collaborator, and they'll be like trying to get us into the normal process, and we'll be like,
Hmm.
yeah, but we don't want to do the normal process for this one, and then you were never like that. You were always like, let's go weirder with it,
Yeah,
and like
exactly. You got to
pushing
go
it.
weirder.
Yeah, and like without losing sight of like, um okay, this thing still needs to be a book at the end of the day, or you're like, we want it to, be a thing people could read and enjoy, not just a bunch of weird things. It's got to have a story. It's got to hit these marks. So I felt like we were all really seeing eye to eye on the ethos of it all and
I
the
agree.
aesthetics of it all, which was nice. And you don't always get that. And so what I liked about, you know, collaborating with you on Last Breeze, but also what I like about Gungnir as a publisher, insofar as, when we decided, because we didn't initially decide to do Last Breeze with Gungnir, we just were doing it. We
Yeah,
had no plan to put it out with. I think at the time we started, you were at Heavy Metal, but there was never a discussion of like, well, let's do it with Heavy Metal, let's do it with Gungnir, let's do it with this. We were just like, let's just do it, and we'll just decide those things later because we'll see how it
exactly.
turns out. And it was very much appreciated amongst us, that you were on the same page of like, let's just sort of see what the thing is first, and then we'll see what best serves this story in terms of
Exactly.
publishing it, in terms of putting it out. What we're so used to, especially talking to people at companies, because at the time you were the representative of this company that we were doing a different book with. Um,
Yes.
but in those discussions, it was never like, well, what's best for this company? It's always like, hey, here's a cool idea. Let's do this cool idea. Let's see where it goes. Let's see how it goes. Um, it is very organic, and you don't always get that organic process when I've never had that organic process dealing with another company. I've had to make my own company to have that organic process. And
Exactly.
so it was really refreshing. And I think it bodes well for how you're doing things at Gungnir. So I'm really optimistic, and everything I've been seeing so far has been great because you've got books out. People can go buy these books right now. We're not like this publisher. They've got like new things coming, but they have been putting out great books. You can go. I really like the Chupacabra book in particular that you did,
Thank you.
which
That one's a really fun one.
Mhm.
I'm really happy with how that book came out and what we can do. Um, with that story and with Alessandra as a character, and I think we're gonna be looking to do a second volume of it too.
Oh, nice. Have you got any last notes for readers who are interested, or viewers, or listeners, or whatever? Most of my audience is writers, but people who are interested in weird, interesting, cool genre comics and fiction. Any sort of like, if you had to sort of summarize why they should
Yeah.
care about Gungnir,
Stay,
why should people
stay,
care about Gungnir?
uh, because we're staying curious so that you can stay curious. I think it's really important for readers, investigators, explorers, whatever you think you want to do, is to use your imagination, and that's what we're having a lot of fun doing. And I think you're never going to find more beautiful packaged books than ours, and I don't think you're going to find more interesting science fiction today. We're really hoping and aiming to create stories that satisfy readers from all angles. The textile feel of it to the brain working in overdrive to contemplate the ideas in the story and everything in between.
Really recommend, again, if you have one book to pick up from Gungnir to start, I would pick Chupacabra, which I think is, that's my sort of personal recommendation. Although there's lots of other great stuff coming out of Gungnir. Mutant Cats I just bought the other day, but I haven't read yet. But it looks great. Um, and thanks so much for talking to me, Matt. And we'll talk again soon when we go in more in depth on Laspberries, I'm sure. And
That sounds great.
keep writing the wrong way.